Hello there, it's a Tuesday, which means it's time for another in real life video. Sorry, the camera is a little wobbly as I've moved the boom arm, but nonetheless, it's another in real life video. This time, it is a sort of topic from me. This one might be a little bit longer, I'm not sure. Either way, this is something that's been kind of on my mind for a while. I've been thinking about it for quite some time. And it's a sort of internal logic that I use. But nonetheless, let's take a few steps back first. This is broadly about, and of course you'll know where this is going given the title, I'm sure. This is broadly about genres in video games, right? Currently, as it stands, they're kind of a gigantic mess, especially role-playing games, right? How often do we have questions and, discourse around like, oh, what is a role-playing game? Is this a role-playing game? So many games that are distinctly not role-playing games have, by this era, incorporated what we would have traditionally, like a long time ago, called role-playing game mechanics, right? Like, there's loads of shooters where there's leveling up, there's progression, you get, new weapons and attachments and stuff unlocked. There's hybrids of the sort. There's driving games now where you can tune the stats of your car in almost a role-playing game sort of way. You level up there, all sorts of stuff like that. And I think it's for the better, right? And ultimately, I think it's a problem, the genre problem of, the identity crisis, as it were. I don't think it's a big deal. I'll be real. I don't think it's an issue whatsoever. 'Cause folks already sort of find a way to talk about what they want to talk about to the people that they want to talk about. And what I mean is we have invented sort of, and that's the nature of language, right? But we have ways of speaking of like new types of games, new subgenres, right? Like Souls-likes, right? Soulsborne. If I say one of those two words, Souls-like or Soulsborne, most people of a certain degree of video game literacy will know exactly what type of game I'm talking about, right? You could go searching for videos based off of the SEO of such words as well. There are entire channels that live and die by them. So I don't think it's a major issue aside from, various like Reddit posts and stuff or conversations on Discords and stuff where people get a little involved in talking about semantics. 'Cause at the end of the day, that's all it is. It's just meaningless semantics. But internally, I do sort of like to think of things in a certain way and organize the YouTube channel in a certain way. And in doing so, I've thought a lot about what it is to be a role-playing game. And in thinking about that, like I said, this is purely internal for me. This is like an internal logic that I use, and you'll sometimes hear me refer to it, or you'll see, like I said, you'll see on the channel where oftentimes I use it for sorting playlists and stuff like that. This is by no means a situation where it's like, oh, this is a call to action. You need to use my little system or whatever, right? No, far from it. More so, this is like a thinking out loud, right? That way, more folks can get on the same page. Maybe folks who have been sort of, wondering about this as well, or consciously or subconsciously, right? Have something to sort of touch on, right? I don't know. But like I said, not a big deal. Not looking to change anyone's minds here with this. So, effectively, what I have come down to when thinking about role-playing games specifically, because of course we are a channel that focuses on various kinds of role-playing games, I have thought long and hard about it and come to the conclusion that I think, at least for now, as it stands, there are three specific pillars, or I guess archetypes, of what a role-playing game can be designed to be, right? At least as it pertains to a video game role-playing game. Maybe not so much tabletop role-playing game, though I think they would fit in just fine as well. So we'll sort of run over the three of them. And like I said, if you go to this channel's homepage and stuff, you'll already be clued into like two of them. And it's not like they're any sort of big surprise, right? And if you're a long-time watcher or listener, you probably already know where I'm going with this. So 3 different types of role-playing games. But first and foremost, what even classifies something as a role-playing game, right? Like I said, the waters are so muddied. Folks will look at a game that has come out and say, is this even really a role-playing game? And I think even in those cases, I think you could sort of argue, I could see a case for saying like a lot of them are not, right? Like, for instance, we're playing Starfield right now, but it also goes back to Fallout 4. And some folks would even say like Skyrim, that those are not technically role-playing games, right? And I would totally understand what you mean, right? Like, I have thought about and seen the arguments in those cases, and I would say, yeah, I see where you're coming from, right? I totally understand what you're saying and where you're coming from with that. It's irrelevant for me to even argue. Like I said, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. It's just semantics. Which is just like the most time-wasting sort of argument you could possibly get into, is an argument over semantics, I feel. But regardless, like I said, I get where folks are coming from. However, I do think under my sort of system, I do include those as role-playing games. So first and foremost, we'll start with, I guess the classic, right? The sort of narrative role-playing game. This is my first one, the narrative role-playing game. So the way in which you take on and play a role in these games is within an existing story, within a narrative, right? You take on the role of a character inside of a pre-crafted story, regardless of how structured or loose it may be. And you are always this one specific character in this story. You can behave in many different ways, but no matter what, you're experiencing this one singular story. There may be side quests and stuff, but for instance, a great example would be honestly, like an archetypical example of this archetype would be like a lot of CRPGs. Probably the most distilled version, I would say, would be Disco Elysium. That is probably the most distilled version of the narrative role-playing game, I would say, right? Wherein sort of staples of this archetype are that, like I said, you are one character. You are always, no matter what, you are always that character in this, right? Even though you have many different parameters by which to define this character, you are always this same character, name or no. You are always the same character existing within this same story, right? And you have, like I was about to say, other staples of this archetype, of this like sort of pillar of role-playing game design, of the narrative RPG, as it were, I would say is branching dialogue, like player agency insofar as choosing where the narrative goes, right? Branching dialogue, of course, dialogue trees, not even necessarily dialogue, but trees of which, the game is mapped out and directions in which it can go. And like I said, Disco Elysium, probably the most distilled version of this because there is effectively zero combat in that game. It is, there are still stats and dice rolls if you're unfamiliar with the game. If you're unfamiliar with the game, you should watch our playthrough of the original version before the final cut came out. But that's neither here nor there. But it is such a distilled version of this archetype. It is like the quintessential narrative role-playing game. And there are many others similar to it, right? Like, for example, a Baldur's Gate, right? That's a fantastic example of the narrative role-playing game, wherein you are always sort of this one character existing in this story, making your way through it. You have agency as a player. The role that you're taking on is this character, and you're choosing how to define that role and how to customize that role to your liking by way of making decisions in the story, in the narrative, right? That is effectively my first one. Now, also, born from the narrative role-playing game, right? I would not say that something like, well, shoot, you could say like Baldur's Gate or like classic Fallout. Classic Baldur's Gate, classic Fallout. I don't know about Baldur's Gate 3. I'm assuming this is also Baldur's Gate 3. I've not played it yet. It's on the to-do list. It's coming up soon. Or soon. But I would say that although these have various stats and stat progression, it's not at the forefront, right? At the forefront is the narrative experience. This is very clearly meant to be the intended experience for the player, right? That's the sort of, it's integral to the gameplay loop. It's integral to the vision behind the game is the narrative experience, right? Although it has stuff involving stats and whatnot, that is not the focus. That is secondary to the experience. That it helps to enhance the rest of it. But make no mistake, of these three pillars of design, of these three archetypes, there are plenty of games that dip into multiple, that build atop multiple pillars, that have multiple pieces of representation within them, right? It's incredibly common. Just as I said, Disco Elysium is probably, off the top of my head, the purest, most distilled version of that, wherein it has very little, if none, of the other archetypes present whatsoever. It is just almost exclusively a narrative role-playing game. Now, as a jumping off point, the second one, I would say, is the action role-playing game. Now, the way in which you take on a role in the action role-playing game is through your action, right? Through some sort of system or mechanical interaction with the game, and it's like we said before with the narrative one, it's integral to the core gameplay loop. So, probably the closest we could get to a quintessential distilled version of the action role-playing game, I would say, and this is also harkens back to sort of the classic example of it that folks would always point toward and say like, oh, this is an ARPG, is sort of your Diablo games, right? But not even necessarily just Diablo, but like, what do you call it? Oh my gosh. Titan Quest, Grim Dawn, or Path of Exile recently, very super duper integral to the genre, or the subgenre, as it were. Very much looking forward to Path of Exile too. But these are, I would say, action role-playing games. You define your role in that world by way of customizing your character, your player agency, right? Your agency as a player, the decisions that you make are important on an action level, right? In an ARPG like Path of Exile, your class does not really impact the story very much at all. In fact, very little impacts the story. There are very few in these games. There are very few, if any, degrees of narrative player agency. And typically, if there is, it's usually in a side quest. It's very rare to have it set up in such a way. But even if there is a significant amount, it's going kind of a hybrid route, right? And like I said, if it is this archetype, it very clearly has a focus on the action, right? And sort of the way in which your agency influences the action is that you're speccing out your character. You're defining your character class and your role within that class, a specialization, as it were, right? There is a huge focus on the statistical part of a role-playing game, on sort of fine-tuning your gear to fulfill a certain role, right? For example, if we look at, like Path of Exile or whatever, if I want to be a spellcaster who summons zombies or a spellcaster who shoots fireballs, that requires a very different degree of building out your character, right? You build out your role as being, oh, I'm a spellcaster, but I have minions, I have zombies with me to do damage in combat. Or I'm a spellcaster and I shoot a bunch of fireballs at people in different ways and all of that. I have to build out my character in a separate way from the person who is also a spellcaster, using similar sort of aesthetic, right? Is still part of like the spellcaster overarching ideology, as it were, and I still have to build out my character in a very, very different way, and there's a whole lot of different other considerations, right? Also, a huge staple of action RPGs, and this is the case in the newer sort of subgenre of ARPG, right? Which we just alluded to, the Soulsborne. Very evident there, but not exclusive to it. A big part of defining whether or not this is an action RPG, a staple of it, as I said, is how much your player action and timing matters, right? In these games, oftentimes, I would almost say every time, but maybe not. Maybe there are like fringe examples of this not being the case. But what is crucial to the identity, I think, of an action role-playing game is that your player inputs on like a controller or whatever, or keyboard and mouse or whatever your input is in many ways vital to what's going on, right? You can dodge attacks. Your timing is imperative in some cases. If you want to parry something, if you want to dodge roll through and use your iframes, that is very much reliant on you, the player, making an action, right? That is not tied to stats, but you do have stats in the game, right? You could have like ways of extending your iframes, doing more damage, taking more hits, stuff like that. This is the action role-playing game. Now, there are others. There is a third one, I think. And as we alluded to, I think that this is the sort of Bethesda role-playing game. And now, as time goes on, we're starting to see more and more folks sort of develop BGS likes, games that feel kind of like Elder Scrolls, that feel kind of like contemporary Fallout, right? But this third archetype, I would describe, I don't even necessarily have a great name for it. Maybe I would call them, and it sounds weird, I think, which probably lends credence to the idea that's not a good name, but the sim RPG, or maybe the immersive RPG. And that's what I'm getting at, is that these are role-playing games that in the same way that a narrative role-playing game takes from, well, like a narrative, or better yet, an action role-playing game takes from an action game, in that, you know, your inputs are critical to the game experience, to the core gameplay loop. In this, immersive sim elements are critical to the core gameplay loop. This sort of goes, or harkens back to, I believe it was like in a behind-the-scenes or early marketing video for Morrowind, wherein none other than Todd Howard is talking about sort of the impetus, the like design goal behind Morrowind, and sort of what they're hoping to achieve. And in so many words, I don't remember it exactly. It's something like, live in another world, live another life, or something like, go to another world, live another life. That is at the core of this sort of immersive role-playing game, this sim role-playing game, this immersive sim role-playing game. So the way in which these are sort of, I would say, I don't know, defined, sort of the staples of this type of role-playing game, this archetype, would be a bunch of systems that are not necessarily even combat or narrative focused, right? Like I said, there's plenty of other indie role-playing games that are being developed right now. I believe there's one that's very much meant to evoke Morrowind, which is on my radar. I forget the name of it. It's like Ardenweld or Ardenveld or something like that, but it's very much meant to be sort of in the vein of Morrowind. There's others similar to this. a great example, and one that I keep getting suggested that I should play, and it is on my to-do list, because make no mistake, I think it 100% falls in this sort of newer, not newer, but less treaded subgenre or archetype of role-playing game. But Kenshi, I think, is a great example. There is a wealth of systems around the entire game, which could be entirely not integral to your character whatsoever. You could play this game for 100+ hours and never even touch an entire system that exists within it. It is meant to be this sort of sandbox experience. If anything, maybe that's the ideal description of it, is a sandbox role-playing game, right? Rather than sim or immersive or those two. Sandbox role-playing game is maybe better. I don't know. I'm still nailing it down. I think immersive or sim, I feel like harkens closer back to immersive sims, right? You know, your sort of Thief games, Deus Ex, stuff like that, Dishonored, immersive sims. I think it harkening back to that is a good thing for as far as like sort of saying the words and people being able to associate it very rapidly and understand what you mean, because ultimately it's communication, right? But like I said, to take a step back, the crux of these is just a load of weird systems that mesh together and function to where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? You know, that old idiom where, for instance, you look at Skyrim. In and of itself, it's got stealth in it, but as a stealth game, it's not that good, right? If you were just saying like, oh, play this cool stealth game, Skyrim, way better to say like, oh yeah, go play like Metal Gear, right? Or something, or Dishonored, shit. But you could also similarly say, oh, this is a game wherein there's some pretty cool crafting in here. But if it's just the crafting in that world, it's not that good, right? Oh, you can decorate your house and stuff. You can live in a house, as it were. You don't even have to interact with the main story in this game. You could just pretend to be some guy living in this city for hours if you wanted to, right? And the game is there to support it, right? Like I said, harkens back to the original promise of Morrowind. Live another life, right? You become immersed in the world. You take on the role of someone who exists in a fictional world. That is the role that you play there. Contrary to ones where you take on the role of a specific character who exists within a specific sort of narrative, or you take on a mechanical role within the core gameplay loop wherein you change up the mechanics of how your character functions and all of that. You take on the role of someone who just persists in the world, right? You could be a dashing thief. You could be a mighty warrior. You could be the legendary dragonborn, as it were. You could be some sort of scientist. You could be, scientist working on synthetic human beings or whatever. You could do all that stuff, right? You could be some kind of fascist in steel armor, right? You could do that as well. But that is sort of the crux of it. Although there are different arcs, at the forefront of the experience is that the sort of staple of it, the sort of vision, is that you don't even need to interact with the story, right? You could play this game and ignore the story and still have a blast, because there are so many wild systems, right? That you could still enjoy a system of that game that feels like a game in and of itself, and you wouldn't even know that the other systems exist, right? For instance, like in Fallout 4, settlement building, there's tons of people who just really get into settlement building and have loads of quest arcs in that game still just unfinished, or they never really touch them, right? But they have a blast with it, right? And true enough, that eggs on sort of the commentary that, oh, I do like Fallout 4, but it's not a good Fallout game, right? Folks will say that. And that, I think, is sort of the issue at the center of that franchise now that is traded hands, right? They're two different types of subgenre now, right? Classic Fallout, right? And even going a bit further, I feel like New Vegas definitely leans into these trappings a lot more. But make no mistake, has the sort of immersive sim role-playing game stuff in there by way of it being baked into that engine. But it's clearly not the focus to me, in my opinion. But with Fallout 4, they really leaned into that. So folks who experienced Fallout 4 first, as their first Fallout game, have a completely different read on what Fallout is, right? For some folks, it is a narrative role-playing game. For other folks, it is this sandbox sort of role-playing game where you go and you make your own stories, right? You aren't necessarily beholden to dialogue trees. Those are secondary. They enhance the sort of sandbox sim experience. They're there if you want to interact with them, but you can still have a great time, play and enjoy yourself for hundreds of hours without really even interacting it, right? Or maybe you even don't like them, right? It doesn't matter. What's crucial, what's integral to it is that you find a segment of the game or multiple segments, multiple systems that exist within a system-rich environment that you do enjoy, right? And that could be parts of the story and the way in which it meshes together with other systems, right? That's the crux of the sort of sandbox, immersive sim role-playing game, is a whole bunch of systems that create a believable world, or not even necessarily a believable world, but an enjoyable world, right? One in which you can get immersed in which you can live another life, right? You don't necessarily have to play as the main hero that's on the back of the box or whatever, as it were, right? Which is why with so many of these games, we see very frequently alternate start mods. You know what I'm saying? Mods where you start, oh, maybe I do want to just begin the game as like an alchemy store owner who lives in Riften, right? Maybe I just want that experience. Those become, among some of the top mods are those like alternate start origins, because some people are like, yeah, I love the world. I love all the systems in the world. I have actually no interest in being the legendary hero. I don't mind if that never even happens, right? I love the world and persisting in it so much. All the systems are fun to interact with and fun to see interact with each other. That is the main draw, right? That is the focus. That is part of the gameplay loop, is seeing all the systems and tweaking with them and toying with them yourself, right? Thus, these are my three pillars, my three archetypes of what a role-playing game is. And as I said, I think a lot of them dip into multiples of these. If we imagine them as pools rather than pillars or archetypes, a lot of them dip into multiple places, right? Case in point, the third one here, it can't help but dip into the others, right? So many cases where games like your BGS games, like Kenshi, from my experience, from what I know of it, it does dip into like storylines and stuff like that. I do think that this third one, the sort of sandbox immersive role-playing game, there are fewer of them, because to design them and to have an engine that even supports it, let alone to flesh out and build all of the systems, is incredibly difficult, right? They are effectively games that have, or could have, multiple games in them, depending on the breadth and depth of the systems within them, right? So you could have, if there's a spellcrafting system, as there is in Morrowind or Oblivion or whatever, that could be like the focus of an entire like wizard playthrough, right? That could be integral to you playing and role-playing as a sort of mage character existing in that world. And that is why there are so few of them. Like I was saying, there are so few of them because it's so difficult to build those out. And they are prone to weird glitches and stuff because there are so many systems just run amok. And that is also, in turn, part of the beauty of it, right? That is part of the beauty of it. I think we will see more and more of these sort of get made over time, but it'll be really slow going. I don't think we'll ever see a point where like folks are rushing to make these sorts of games unless they have like some sort of surefire way to get through it, because they very much, like I said, they very much rely on just building out and fleshing out so many different systems to sort of create that immersive world experience, right? It's super difficult as a developer and super high risk, right? Because you are building out so much, you're putting so much time and effort into it that, especially if you're like a new studio, if you immediately go into that, it is such a huge risk if it does not pay off, right? Whereas it's so much simpler to just be like, oh yeah, we just want to focus very closely on, we're just going to be an action role-playing game or a narrative role-playing game, wherein we expect most of our players will just skip the dialogue, right? We think that 90% of our players won't even listen to what our characters are saying. We'll voice them and all that, but we don't expect folks to really pay that much attention. Maybe they'll watch a YouTube lore video while they're playing the game. But for most folks, we want to focus on the core combat loop. We want to focus on the branching dialogue and the storyline and all of that and reactivity. We want that to be spot on, right? Whereas this third one, it's so weird and bizarre that it is kind of inherently prone to tripping over itself, right? And for some folks, that is irritating, right? For some folks, that is incredibly irritating, but for a lot of folks as well, who do really appreciate that. And in so many words, maybe they don't even recognize that this is a type of role-playing game that they enjoy. Like myself included, I kind of enjoy when things break in a fun way, right? That is a joy in and of itself in these sorts of experiences, right? But yeah, that's sort of my thinking on the 3 different role-playing game archetypes, design pillars, visions, philosophies, whatever you want to call them. At the end of the day, none of it matters. Really, none of it is important whatsoever. You could take it or leave it. It's all semantics at the end of the day. I dislike getting too worked up into discourse around sort of just debating semantics on this. Like, who really cares, right? So long as you can get your point across to who you're talking to about what the game is, that's all that matters. But like I said at the beginning of this is sort of my own internal logic. It's an in real life video, so I figured, hey, I'd share it. We're doing sort of a vlog thing here. Sort of share my sort of internal reasoning and how I intend to organize the channel. Like I said, you can already see it. I'm sure as we eventually see more of these sandbox, immersive, sim, role-playing games sort of appear and we play them on the channel, we'll see more of them, right? Shit, as far as immersive sim role-playing games or sandbox role-playing games, I would even go so far as to say that sort of your eponymous, your titular survival crafting game is not far off from that. If not for the fact that those were already well defined as being survival crafting, right? I would say that those very closely, many times, come to inhabit that same space, right? Some of them have a ridiculous amount of systems at play in there, right? Whereas others are mainly focused on surviving and crafting, right? They have like 2 or 3 systems, one where you're crafting, and then a couple related to survival, right? It really depends. Like I said, if it didn't already exist as survival crafting, I would say that I could see clear arguments for people like saying, oh, this is kind of that same sort of sandbox role-playing game, right? And I want to say early on for a lot of those, they were described as such, right? People would tack on before sort of survival crafting became part of like common parlance that folks used and whatnot. I do think that whenever we had to label them and give a genre to these sorts of games, you know, I do think that that came up, right? That people would describe them as a sandbox role-playing game. It has aspects of a sandbox role-playing game, right? But nowadays, it's not necessarily at the forefront. The forefront is surviving and crafting. Whereas in these other sorts of sandbox role-playing games, these immersive role-playing games, these sim role-playing games, whatever term we want to use, it is surviving and crafting is not necessarily at the forefront. They do not necessarily even have survival elements to them, right? You don't necessarily need to sleep or eat or drink. You will see frequently that could be the case. Historically, we've seen instances where those are also among some of the more popular mods for these sorts of games, right? Make no mistake, there's survival mods for Morrowind, for Oblivion, Skyrim, right? All of those have them. And it feels like a natural fit because, like we said, it's a very systems-heavy game, a very systems-heavy environment. It's meant to make you feel like you are living another life in another world, right? Hopefully, that sort of nails it down. We spent extra time, I feel, on the third one, but that's because it's a bit more of a, like, it's not as well outlined. I don't know of many other people who refer to them in such a way, right? At least I haven't heard them in my circles that I pay much attention to. But that said, maybe I don't listen to many circles, or in my circles, maybe I don't have that many people who are as obsessed with these sorts of games as I am. But nonetheless, the 3 archetypes, pillars of role-playing games. Narrative, your sort of classic CRPG, newer stuff that sort of goes along the same ilk, where it's a focused narrative experience. You're a character within a story. You are playing the role of someone within that story. You have agency over that, where the story goes. Action role-playing game, you take on the role in which how you express your action in the world, right? You express action. Your player agency is your action. You have decisions over how you perform that action, how you interact with the enemies, how you deal damage, how you evade damage, whatnot. That is the role that you take on. And the immersive role-playing game, the sim or sandbox role-playing game, you have agency over what type of life your character lives or exists as in this world, right? That is at the forefront of the experience, is sort of hopefully building out a world in which you can take on the role of someone who just lives there, right? You could be a hero living in that world, or you could just be some guy. You could be some, like, criminal, right? Like that, yeah, for instance, that's a great staple of these is a crime system, right? Some sort of crime system in that way. And in that sense, I've even heard some people, sorry, not to dwell on this, this is a little wild because so many times are role-playing games married to stats and progression in this way, right? But that isn't necessary, as we mentioned with Disco Elysium. As far as like combat stats, doesn't exist there. The stats all apply to narrative. But I've heard some people with a hot take, and I like their thinking with this. I mean, I wouldn't ever describe it to someone, but you know, if we're talking amongst people who have played a lot of games and we're just sort of having like an open discussion and fun, just shooting the shit and thinking about this in a fun way, I've heard some people describe Red Dead Redemption 2 as practically a role-playing game. And I think that is a very spicy and fun take. I think that is a very, like I said, I wouldn't ever say it to someone who is unfamiliar with games or unfamiliar with role-playing games or whatever, right? But if I know who I'm talking to, and it's someone who is of a like mind, who would appreciate it being called such, I think that offers a lot to think about. And I do think that, if not for the focus so much on its main story, Red Dead Redemption 2 100% does have loads of weird and wild systems in there, right? If that game were more open-ended and less funneled down the main storyline to progress to different parts of the game, it 100% would totally be in that same wheelhouse, right? You have to change so little about how that game functions in order for it to be a sort of sandbox role-playing game, that immersive role-playing game, you know? There are very few things you have to tweak. It's just a fun little thought experiment, right? Once, like we said, there's different levels of thinking about this sort of stuff. Once you get to a point where you're like sort of thinking about it in like a fun and entertaining way, sort of thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be weird if this game were kind of like this or whatever, right? Just being a bit of a fucking idiot, right? It's fun to think about these things in this way, right? It's enjoyable, at least for me. Anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed this video. Like I said, it did turn out to be a bit of a longer one. We'll have another in real life video. I've had a lot of folks actually weirdly suggesting and asking for more watch-alongs, which I've just been kind of busy. So I haven't had the opportunity to do watch-alongs. If I had more time and like energy for it, I would have loved to have done a watch-along for that first VTMB2, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 sort of gameplay reveal. I would have loved to have done that. I had some folks asking about the Dragon's Dogma trailers, and there was another recent one. Oh, the Shadow of the Erd Tree short trailer. I've had at least one person ask if I would do a watch along, and I don't know if I have time. I've been it's tax season. I've been whittling away at that. You'll notice that we've also put out fewer shorts. That is where that time is going toward tax season, as it were. But nonetheless, it is. I'm noting the demand, right? I'm noting the demand, and I don't mind doing it. I do enjoy doing it quite a bit, but I'm trying to be responsible, right? And I don't want to push myself too wild and like pull myself in too many directions and whatnot, because I feel like that only leads to some degree of misery. But you know what? That's probably a better topic for another in real life video, sort of avoiding burnout. That's a long coming one, I think. I've talked about that and alluded to that for quite some time. But also, speaking of upcoming videos, in real life videos, feel free to, we didn't do it this week, but feel free to send in more questions. I continually have a big spreadsheet that I refer to that has, well, not even a spreadsheet. Yeah, it's a Word document. Well, not Word document, the free one, whatever the open source one was. I forget the name of it technically, but it's the open source version of Microsoft Word. I've got a document of that wherein I've just got a big list of questions, and we pull from it occasionally per week, right? The in real life videos, I enjoy doing them and whatnot. We may need to up the ante, especially as there are more sort of watch-alongs. Or I guess the normal term would be it's just react content, right? It's reaction video or whatever, right? But I can't deny it. I enjoy doing it, and I like watching them. I've certainly listed off folks that I pay heed to before, and I don't know. Sometimes I like hearing what they have to say about, or maybe they don't even have anything. They're just shooting the shit while they watch it, right? It's kind of enjoyable in and of itself. Who can say? We're very fickle, huh? All right, not to get too philosophical, I guess we better end this damn thing. All right. That ought to do it. Like I said, feel free to submit further questions and whatnot. Until next time, please take care of each other.